feel we need to explain, we know what an appropriate explanation would be, right? And we provide it. The confabulation results, of course, really came to the fore with the split brain patients. And even now, I am spellbound when Mike Gazzaniga talks about the following kind of thing. So there is Vicky. You flash to her right hemisphere a message. And the message says, get up and close the door. Vicky gets up, closes the door, and you ask her, now it's only her left hemisphere that can speak, you say, so why'd you close the door? She says, it's breezy in here. Or she'll say, I wanted some privacy. She never, ever says, I don't know, I just did. She never says, look, I'm a split brain patient. You probably flashed something to my right hemisphere. It's very interesting. I mean, we have this way of organizing what we think we are, which is very, very interesting. All right. Dan Dennett has often said that, and this is something that, you know, at a phenomenological level, like if you just attend introspectively to what's going on, that often it's not like a decision is an event. It's like you're sort of waiting for the decision to bubble up, right? You think, well, what should I really do here? Well, I'll go sleep on it, and you wake up, it's there. You know what to do. So the thought is, at this point, that it may be that we need to really kind of rethink the whole structure of what goes into decision making and choice and so forth. And part of what I'm going to suggest a little bit later is that the notion of self-control might actually serve us better in this context than the notion of free will. Because free will seems to suggest, for example, that either you have it or you don't. Whereas we know self-control comes in degrees and can vary as a function of all kinds of things, including developmental stages, hormones, brain damage, and so on. And then I think it will be easier too, if we have that kind of a framework, to begin to think about the neurobiology of self-control and how it is possible for something to have dysfunctional self-control. And we'll talk a bit about that in the context of frontal damaged patients. But more importantly, how is it that we can defer gratification? What's the circuitry for that? I know how folk psychology invites me to think of that. That I have a strong will and that sometimes my will is weak. But that can't be right. And one thought, and Guy Claxton has, as I think, a very interesting idea about this, is that part of what goes into developing self-control and learning to defer gratification is learning to predict what things are troublesome for you and then doing them slowly, right? So you've been punished for a certain event, you're tempted by it. If you do it slowly, it allows time for the brain to construct other scenarios, to construct mental images of the bad thing that will happen, and that allows different circuits to take over and so forth. And so it's a way, this is very preliminary obviously, but I think it is a kind of invitation to think about a research strategy that looks at the will in quite different ways. So now I kind of want to switch gears a little bit, because at the beginning I said that the notion of responsibility is part of what makes discussions about choice so important. I mean, it's not just that we want to understand ourselves, and that's certainly part of it, but we also live together. And so I want to start with a very common idea, which once you've kind of stripped away all of the sophisticated verbiage and just put it down in its horrible nakedness, it's obviously not a good argument. But people do, sorry.
I have a question today.
Yes.
The confabulation thing.
Yes.
So before that we talked about an internal sense of self, and that being distinct from the external world. So having to confabulate, it kind of comes by default because we're having an internal. That we have a sense of ourselves. And suppose we were supposed to say things that were in general or the factual belief, and that would actually diminish the boundaries between self and non-self.
What an interesting question. The question is whether or not confabulation and the way that we proceed to explain our behavior in this framework we have, if that were actually replaced by something more accurate, might that not in fact diminish this separation between this thing and that thing, between self and non-self? And it is an extremely interesting question, and I don't know how to answer it. So I'll just say one little thing, and that is, it is very interesting, of course, to think about those sorts of cases where there is a breakdown between self and non-self. And the classic case are in the depersonalizations. When people take ketamine, for example, normal people will experience a kind, I've not done it, so I can only report what people say, but it's a kind of fascinating thing that it's as though the boundaries no longer exist. And of course, notoriously, this is also true in schizophrenia. So, but it's a very interesting idea that perhaps part of what we need to keep self from non-self separate is that we have one story about this thing and a quite different story about the other thing. Wonderful idea. So, in thinking about the idea of free will, and perhaps with a view to preserving the folk psychological idea of a creative will, someone might argue as follows, that we can retain the notion of holding someone morally responsible only if you have this causal vacuum type free will, contra-causal free will. We do, in fact, hold people morally responsible, so there must be such a thing as contra-causal free will. Now, it's obviously a bad argument. It's a fallacious argument, for one thing. But I'm wondering about that first premise. I think we hold people morally responsible even though they are causal machines. So where does this idea of moral responsibility come from, and what's it all about, and what gives it legs? And I want to approach that in a way as a scientist would, as opposed to thinking about it independently of what we already know about our genetic nature and our social nature. I think the most plausible explanation is that attributing moral responsibility and sanctioning for unacceptable behavior arises from the social need for civil behavior. If we're going to live together, we get tremendous benefits. We can engage in group defense, we can share food, and then of course in a technologically advanced society, I don't have to pull my own teeth or amputate my own leg or make my own shoes or fly my own airplane and so forth. Animals who live in groups, this is true of primates, wolves, and birds, social birds. If they live in the group, they thrive and flourish and live much longer than if they don't. So from a biological point of view, and I'll get back to this a little bit later, the idea of moral responsibility seems to be part of what we exact as a cost for you to get the benefits of being in the society. And so we need to socialize children, we need to protect ourselves from those who would otherwise be violent, we need to be able to deter people, And this is something on which I think Richard Dawkins and I probably disagree, but I think that revenge is probably a kind of ineliminable urge that humans have. It may be morally unacceptable. I have no way of evaluating that. But it's clearly a very important thing to have institutions, in our case the criminal justice system, for revenge, because if people take the law into their own hands, then there's retaliation and more retaliation. It goes back